Ethan hadn't been inside his grandmother's house in almost 8 years. The place looked smaller than he remembered. The wooden porch creaked under his weight as he stepped up to the door, and the familiar smell of dust and old varnish greeted him the moment he pushed it open. It was the same house he had visited as a child every summer, yet now it felt strangely hollow, as if the life that once filled it had quietly drained away. His grandmother had lived there for more than 50 years. Now the house belonged to no one. The lawyer had told Ethan and his mother they could take whatever personal items they wanted before the property was sold. His mother couldn't bring herself to come. She said it felt wrong to walk through the rooms again so soon. So Ethan came alone. The silence inside the house was heavy. Even the air seemed still, unmoving, as though the place had been waiting. He walked slowly through the living room, running his hand along the back of an old armchair that had always sat near the window. The fabric felt rough beneath his fingers. Everything looked exactly as it had years ago. The same crooked lamp, the same faded curtains, the same coffee table with a small scratch in the corner from when he had dropped a toy truck as a kid. Nothing had changed, except the absence. He sighed quietly and moved deeper into the house. Most of the afternoon passed in quiet work. Ethan sorted through drawers, packed a few keepsakes, and placed old dishes into cardboard boxes. The routine helped keep his mind busy. It gave him something practical to focus on instead of the strange feeling that the house was watching him remember it. Near sunset, he finally opened the door to the attic. The wooden ladder groaned as he pulled it down from the ceiling. Dust floated through the beam of light from the hallway as he climbed up into the narrow space above the house. The attic smelled older than the rest of the building. The air was thick with the scent of paper and dry wood. Stacks of boxes filled most of the space. Some were labeled in his grandmother's careful handwriting. Others had no markings at all. Ethan crouched down beside the nearest one and brushed away a layer of dust before lifting the lid. Inside were photo albums. Dozens of them. The covers were worn with age, some bound in cracked leather, others in soft fabric that had faded over time. Ethan pulled one out and opened it slowly. The first photograph showed his grandmother as a young woman standing beside a car that looked like it belonged in a museum. Her hair was pinned neatly behind her head, and she was smiling in the bright sunlight. He flipped to the next page. Another photo, a small family gathering outside the house. Ethan recognized the porch behind them, though the paint looked newer in the picture. He kept turning pages. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, backyard barbecues. Entire decades of quiet family history preserved in fading color and black and white frames. For a while, he forgot where he was. It felt strangely comforting to look through them, like stepping back into a simpler time that still existed inside these pages. Then he noticed something odd. In one of the photographs from the early 1970s, several relatives were standing together in the yard during what looked like a summer afternoon. Ethan didn't recognize most of the faces, but that wasn't surprising. Some of them were probably distant relatives or neighbors, but behind them, near the far edge of the property, someone else stood. A man. He was far enough away that his face wasn't clear, but his shape was unmistakable. He stood partially in the shadow of a tree, looking directly toward the camera. Ethan frowned slightly. He studied the image for a moment longer. The man didn't appear to be part of the group. He wasn't smiling like the others, and he stood several yards behind them, almost as if he hadn't meant to be in the photo at all. Probably just someone walking by, Ethan muttered to himself. The house had always been close to a dirt road back then. It wouldn't have been unusual for a stranger to pass through the background of a picture. He flipped the page. Another photo from a few years later, a birthday party inside the house. Children gathered around a table with a cake, balloons tied to chairs, paper hats tilted crookedly on their heads. Ethan smiled faintly as he looked at the scene. Then his eyes drifted toward the background of the image. Near the doorway that led into the hallway stood a tall figure. His smile faded. It was the same man. The clothes were different this time, darker, more modern for the era, but the posture was identical, standing quietly in the background, facing the camera, watching. Ethan leaned closer to the page. The man's face was still difficult to make out clearly, but there was something about the way he stood that made the image feel wrong. He didn't appear blurred like someone who had accidentally walked through the frame. He looked intentional, present, as if he had been waiting for the picture to be taken. Ethan sat back slightly, rubbing the back of his neck. Okay, that's weird. He flipped forward several more pages, curiosity replacing the brief unease that had crept into his chest. Another year, another gathering, another photo. And again, in the far corner of the image, partially obscured by the edge of a fence, stood the same figure, the same posture, the same quiet stillness. Ethan felt a slow chill move through him. He reached for another album from the box and opened it quickly, turning pages faster this time. Different years, different locations, but every few photos, there he was. Sometimes far away, near the edge of the frame, sometimes behind a tree, sometimes standing in the background of a crowded room. The same man, always looking directly into the camera. Ethan's heartbeat began to pick up. He grabbed another album, more photographs. The pattern continued. The decades changed, the hairstyles changed, the cameras improved, but the man never did. He didn't age. He didn't move closer to the people in the pictures. He just appeared again and again, standing quietly somewhere behind them, watching. Ethan stared down at one of the photos from the late 1980s. His grandmother was standing in front of the house with a group of relatives he barely recognized. Everyone looked happy. Sunlight filled the yard. And about 20 feet behind them, near the fence line, stood the man. The distance made his face impossible to see clearly, but Ethan could feel it. The way the figure's head angled slightly toward the lens, the way his body seemed perfectly still compared to everyone else in the frame, almost like he had been waiting. Ethan slowly closed the album and sat in silence for a moment. The attic suddenly felt colder. He glanced around the dim space, half expecting someone to be standing behind him. But there was no one there. Just boxes, dust, and the quiet creak of the old house settling in the evening air. After a moment, he opened the album again and looked back at the photograph. The man stood exactly where he had been before, unchanged. Ethan swallowed slowly. Then he noticed something that made the unease in his chest tighten even further. In the earliest photographs, the man had been very far away, almost hidden in the distance. But in the more recent pictures, he wasn't standing nearly as far back anymore. Ethan barely slept that night. The attic had grown too dark to keep going through the albums, so he carried 3 of them down to the living room and spread them across the coffee table. The lamps cast warm pools of yellow light over the photographs, but the rest of the house remained in shadow. Every creak of the floorboards made him glance over his shoulder. The man in the photos never moved. No matter how many times Ethan looked back at the same images, the figure remained exactly where he had been before. Silent, distant, watching the camera. Around midnight, Ethan took pictures of several of the photographs with his phone and sent them to his mother. He didn't explain much, just one message. "Do you recognize this guy?" For a while, there was no response. Ethan leaned back on the couch and stared at the ceiling while the house ticked quietly around him. His phone buzzed about 20 minutes later. His mother had replied. "What guy?" Ethan frowned and opened the message. She had already started typing again. "I just see Grandma and Uncle Daniel in the yard." He felt a strange knot form in his stomach. He zoomed in on the photo he had sent. The man was clearly visible near the fence line. Tall, thin, standing perfectly upright with his hands at his sides. "Look in the background," Ethan typed. "Near the fence." A few seconds passed. Then 3 dots appeared on the screen. "That's just a shadow," she replied. Ethan stared at the message. "No," he muttered quietly. He opened the photo again and zoomed in even further. The image became grainy, but the shape of the man was still obvious to him. His mother's phone buzzed again. "Are you messing with me?" "No," Ethan typed quickly. "Look at the other photo I sent." A minute passed. Then another. Finally, his phone rang. He answered immediately. "Mom?" Her voice sounded confused. "Ethan, what exactly are you seeing in these pictures?" "The guy," he said, sitting upright. "He's in the background. He's in a bunch of them." There was a pause on the line. "I don't see anyone," she said slowly. Ethan rubbed his eyes. "He's right there. Tall guy, standing behind everyone." Another silence. "Ethan," she said carefully, "I've looked at those pictures for 30 years. If someone strange had been standing behind our family in every photo, I think I would have noticed." His chest tightened slightly. "You're sure?" he asked. "I'm sure." Ethan hesitated. "What about Grandma? Did she ever mention someone like that?" "No." The answer came quickly. "She would have said something if a stranger kept appearing in her pictures. That kind of thing would have creeped her out." Ethan looked down at the album on the table. The man stood quietly in the yard behind the group, still watching. "Maybe it's just the way the shadows line up," his mother suggested gently. "Old cameras do weird things." Ethan didn't answer right away, because he was looking at another photograph now. This one had been taken years later. The image showed the inside of the house during a Christmas dinner. The dining room table was crowded with relatives, and the man stood in the hallway doorway behind them. "Ethan?" his mother said. "Yeah?" "You're probably just tired. It's been a long day." "Yeah," he said again, though he wasn't listening. "Try to get some sleep. We can go through the rest of the stuff together later this week." "Okay." They said goodnight, and the call ended. The house returned to silence. Ethan slowly placed the phone down and leaned closer to the album. If his mother couldn't see the man, that meant one of 2 things. Either she was right, or she had somehow never noticed. He grabbed another album and opened it. More photographs, more years. And there he was again. The man never smiled. He never interacted with anyone in the frame. He just stood somewhere behind the family, always looking straight at the camera. Ethan began organizing the photos across the coffee table. Oldest on the left, newest on the right. He studied them carefully. In the earliest photos, the man had been barely visible, a small figure near the horizon. In later photos, he stood near fences, trees, or the edge of a porch. Closer. In the newest pictures, he was much nearer. Sometimes just a few steps behind whoever was holding the camera. Ethan felt the same chill creep through his chest again. The distance was shrinking. He picked up a photo from the early 2000s. His grandmother stood in the backyard, smiling beside a table of food. The man stood behind the wooden fence just a few feet away, still watching. Ethan flipped to the last page of the album. The final photo looked relatively recent, maybe 5 or 6 years old. His grandmother sat in a lawn chair, sunlight bright across the grass, and standing just behind her, the man. This time he was close enough that Ethan could see more details. Dark clothes, long arms, a face that seemed pale compared to the others, but the strangest part was his expression. He wasn't looking at Ethan's grandmother. He was looking at the camera, directly. Ethan set the album down slowly. The pattern was undeniable now. Every decade, every album, the man had moved closer, not toward the family, toward whoever had taken the picture. A cold realization crept into Ethan's mind. He stood up and looked around the living room. Then he slowly picked up his phone. Without thinking too much about it, he lifted the camera and took a photo of the room. The flash lit the walls for a brief second. Everything looked normal. The couch, the coffee table, the hallway leading deeper into the house. He glanced at the image quickly and lowered the phone. Nothing unusual, just the empty living room. "See," he muttered, "you're just freaking yourself out." But a few minutes later, when he picked up the phone again and looked closer at the photo, his stomach dropped. Because in the reflection of the dark window behind the couch, there was a tall shape standing in the room. And Ethan was absolutely certain he had been alone when he took the picture. Ethan did not sleep at all that night. He sat on the couch with his phone in his hands, staring at the photograph he had taken of the living room. Every few minutes, he zoomed in again on the reflection in the window, hoping he had misinterpreted what he saw. But the shape never changed. In the reflection of the glass behind the couch stood a tall figure. It wasn't detailed enough to make out a face. The reflection was too dark for that, but the outline was unmistakable. Long arms, narrow shoulders, and a stillness that felt disturbingly familiar. It looked exactly like the man from the photographs. Ethan set the phone down slowly and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "No," he whispered. The words sounded weak in the quiet room. He forced himself to stand and walk toward the window. The glass reflected the living room behind him, the lamp, the couch, the stacks of photo albums scattered across the table. But there was no one else in the room. Ethan stepped closer, studying the reflection carefully. Only himself stared back. He exhaled slowly. Okay. His voice sounded unconvincing even to him. The logical part of his brain insisted there had to be an explanation. Light reflections could distort shapes. The camera flash might have created a strange shadow. Maybe something outside had reflected through the glass. But the deeper he thought about it, the less sense that explanation made. The figure had been inside the room. He knew that. He turned away from the window and looked back at the coffee table. The photographs were still spread across the surface in a rough timeline. Ethan sat down again and began examining them more carefully than before. Not just the man, everything around him. He leaned closer to the earliest photo again, the one where the man stood far away near the edge of the yard. The distance between him and the camera had to be at least 30 feet. In the next photo, taken several years later, the man stood closer. Maybe 20 feet? Another album. Another decade. Now he stood near a fence line about 10 feet away. Ethan's breathing grew slower as the realization built in his mind. It wasn't random. It was movement. Not sudden movement, not obvious movement, but slow, consistent progress. The man was getting closer with every photograph. Ethan grabbed another album and flipped through it faster. Page after page, more gatherings, more holidays, more quiet moments of family history. And every time the man appeared, the distance shrank just a little more. By the late 1990s, he was standing inside the yard. By the early 2000s, he appeared in the background of the house itself. Ethan stopped at one photograph that made his stomach tighten. It showed the inside of the living room, the same living room he was sitting in now. The couch looked newer in the photo, but the layout of the room was identical. His grandmother sat in the armchair by the window, smiling toward the camera. Behind her, in the hallway leading deeper into the house, the man stood in the darkness. Ethan slowly turned his head and looked toward the hallway. The corridor behind him was empty, but it suddenly felt much longer than it had a moment ago. He looked back down at the photograph. The man in the hallway stood perfectly still, arms at his sides, head angled slightly toward the camera, watching. Ethan swallowed. "How did no one notice this?" he whispered. His voice sounded too loud in the room. He turned the page. Another photo. This one was more recent. It looked like it had been taken with a digital camera instead of film. His grandmother stood in the kitchen holding a pie, laughing at something outside the frame. Behind her, near the doorway that led into the dining room, the man stood again, closer than ever, only a few steps away from her. Ethan felt a cold tension tighten across his shoulders. He reached for the last album in the stack. This one was thinner. The photographs inside were more modern, printed from digital files instead of developed film. He flipped through them carefully. Family visits, holiday dinners, photos taken during casual afternoons. And the man appeared again and again. Now he was inside the house in nearly every image, standing near doorways, standing near windows, standing at the edge of rooms, always behind someone, always facing the camera. Ethan's pulse began to rise. He turned to the last page. The final photograph had been taken only a few years earlier. His grandmother sat on the back porch with a blanket over her lap, smiling warmly toward the camera. Behind her, the man stood on the porch steps, just a few feet away. This time his face was clearer than before, still pale, still expressionless, but unmistakably human, except for one detail: his eyes. Even in the faded photograph, Ethan could see the direction of his gaze. The man was not looking at Ethan's grandmother. He was looking directly into the lens, directly at whoever had taken the picture. Ethan slowly set the album down. The pattern was undeniable now. The man wasn't following the family. he wasn't watching them. He was watching the camera, watching the photographer, watching the person behind the lens. A cold thought slid into Ethan's mind. What if that was the reason no one else had noticed him? What if the only person who ever really saw the man was the one taking the picture? Ethan suddenly remembered something. He grabbed his phone again and opened the photo he had taken earlier that night. The reflection in the window showed the tall silhouette standing somewhere behind him. But Ethan had been holding the phone when he took the photo. He had been the one behind the camera. Slowly, carefully, he zoomed in on the reflection. The shape behind him was tall. Too tall to be mistaken for a piece of furniture. Too still to be a shadow. Ethan's heartbeat grew louder in his ears, because the more he looked at the reflection, the more he realized something else. The figure wasn't standing across the room. It was standing in the hallway, much closer than he had first thought. And the longer he stared at the image, the more another disturbing detail began to emerge. The angle of the reflection suggested something impossible. The figure wasn't looking at the camera. It was looking at him. Ethan's phone vibrated suddenly in his hand, making him jump. A message from his mother appeared on the screen. He opened it quickly. "I found another old photo you might want to see." A second later, another image appeared in the chat. Ethan opened it. The photograph was old and slightly faded. It showed a bedroom. In the center of the frame, a small child slept peacefully beneath a blanket. The child was Ethan. He recognized the old bed instantly, but his attention snapped immediately to the corner of the room, because standing there in the shadows was the man. Closer than in any photo Ethan had seen before, and for the first time, his face was completely visible. Ethan stared at the photograph on his phone for a long time before he realized he had stopped breathing. The image was old. The colors were faded slightly, and the lighting suggested it had been taken sometime late at night. A small lamp illuminated the corner of the bedroom where a young Ethan slept beneath a thick blanket, one arm hanging loosely off the side of the bed. But that wasn't what held his attention. In the far corner of the room, near the closet door, stood the man. Closer than he had ever appeared in any photograph before. For years, the figure had remained distant, yards away, hidden behind fences or trees or doorways. But in this image, he stood only a few feet from the bed, and for the first time, Ethan could see his face clearly. The man looked ordinary. That was the most unsettling part. He wasn't distorted or monstrous. His features were human, his skin pale but natural, his expression calm and unreadable. His hair was dark and combed neatly, and he wore a plain jacket that could have belonged to almost any decade. Except for his eyes. They were fixed directly on the camera, not on the child sleeping in the bed, not on anything else in the room, just the camera. Ethan felt a cold shiver travel down his spine. His phone buzzed again with another message from his mother. "Your grandmother took that photo. She said you looked peaceful and she wanted to remember the moment." Ethan swallowed. "Did she ever mention someone being in the room?" he typed back. A few seconds passed. Then her reply came. "No. Why would there have been someone in the room?" Ethan didn't answer, because he already knew the truth. The man hadn't been standing there for Ethan. He had been standing there for the camera. Ethan lowered the phone slowly and looked around the living room again. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The hallway stretched into darkness beyond the edge of the lamp's light. The same hallway that appeared in several of the photographs. The same hallway where the man had stood in the background of an old picture decades earlier. Ethan felt his heartbeat begin to climb. He forced himself to focus. Think. There had to be something he was missing. He walked back to the coffee table and studied the photographs again, but this time he ignored the people in them completely. Instead, he focused only on one thing: where the camera had been. In the earliest photographs, the photographer had stood far away from the man, which meant the man had also been far away. But over time, the camera positions changed. Family members moved around the yard, inside the house, through different rooms. And every time the camera moved, the man appeared somewhere behind it. Not randomly, not wandering, always positioned behind whoever had taken the picture before. Ethan felt the realization form slowly, like a puzzle finally locking into place. The man didn't move through space. He moved through photographs. Every time someone took a picture, he advanced. Only a few feet. Only enough to appear in the background of the next one. Step by step. Image by image. Generation by generation. And always closer to the person holding the camera. Ethan suddenly remembered something else. He picked up his phone and opened the photo he had taken earlier that night. The reflection in the window showed the tall silhouette behind him. At first, he had assumed the figure was across the room, but now he looked more carefully at the angles of the reflection. The position, the distance. His stomach twisted. The figure hadn't been across the room at all. It had been standing much closer. Just inside the hallway. Only a few feet behind him. Ethan's eyes slowly lifted toward the dark corridor. Nothing moved. The silence pressed heavily against the walls. Okay, Ethan whispered to himself. Okay, this is just coincidence. But the words felt weak, because the pattern was too clear now. The man had been getting closer for decades, and Ethan had just taken a photograph, which meant the next one would place him even nearer. A slow, creeping dread spread through Ethan's chest. He realized something else, something worse. Every photograph in the albums had one thing in common. The man always appeared behind someone who had taken the previous picture, which meant the person with the camera eventually became the one in front of it. Eventually, the camera changed hands, but the man never disappeared. He simply moved closer to the next photographer. Ethan felt his pulse pounding in his ears now. He slowly raised the phone again. The camera screen reflected the living room in dim light. The couch, the hallway, the shadows along the walls. His thumb hovered over the shutter button. He hesitated, because a terrible thought had entered his mind. If the pattern was real, then taking another picture would move the man again. Closer. Much closer. Ethan lowered the phone slightly. "Don't be stupid," he muttered. But curiosity and fear twisted together inside his chest. He needed to know. Slowly, carefully, Ethan lifted the phone and aimed the camera toward the hallway. The screen showed the dark corridor stretching away from the living room. Empty. Silent. He pressed the button. The flash exploded briefly across the walls. For a second, the house looked frozen in bright white light. Then darkness returned. Ethan looked down at the photo. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Just the hallway, the same narrow corridor he had been staring at for the last several minutes. Then his eyes drifted toward the far end of the image. His breath caught in his throat. Because standing just behind him, close enough that part of a shoulder appeared in the frame, was the man. Ethan did not move for several seconds. His phone trembled slightly in his hand as he stared at the image on the screen. The hallway looked exactly the way it always had. Narrow, dimly lit, the old wallpaper faded with age. But near the edge of the photograph, just behind his shoulder, the shape was unmistakable. A man stood in the frame. Only part of him was visible: a shoulder, the outline of an arm, the side of a pale face turned slightly toward the camera. Too close. Far too close. Ethan slowly turned around. The hallway behind him was empty. There was no one standing there. No movement, no sound. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator somewhere deeper in the house. His chest tightened as he looked back at the phone. The man was still in the photograph, still standing just behind him, watching. Ethan's heart pounded violently in his chest now. Every instinct in his body told him to leave the house immediately, to walk out the front door and never look back. But another part of him, the part that had spent the last several hours piecing together the pattern, understood something else. The man moved through photographs. Every time a new picture was taken, he stepped closer. And Ethan had just taken one, which meant the next step would be even nearer. A terrible thought crept into his mind. What if the man was already standing behind him? Not in the hallway, not across the room, but right behind him, so close that the camera could barely capture him. Ethan swallowed hard and lifted the phone again. His hand felt heavy now, like it belonged to someone else. He slowly switched the camera to face forward. The screen showed his own face in the dim light of the living room. His expression was pale and tense. The hallway stretched behind him in the background. Empty. Ethan hesitated. Then he pressed the shutter button. The flash burst across the room. For an instant, everything was bright. Then darkness returned. Ethan looked down at the new photograph. His stomach dropped, because the man was no longer behind him. He was standing directly beside him. His face was visible now. Pale skin, dark hair, calm expression, and eyes that looked straight into the camera, straight into Ethan. The man's head was tilted slightly, almost as if he were studying him. Ethan's breathing became shallow. He knew what would happen next. There was only one step left. One final photograph. One final movement. The man had been approaching the camera for decades. Photo by photo. Person by person. And now Ethan was the one holding it. His fingers tightened around the phone. He should stop. He should throw the phone away. But the pattern demanded completion. And somewhere deep inside his mind, Ethan realized something else. The man wasn't forcing this. He was waiting. Waiting for the photograph to be taken. Ethan slowly raised the phone one last time. His hands were shaking now. He switched the camera again so it faced outward into the room. The living room appeared on the screen. The couch, the window, the hallway, empty. Ethan took a slow breath. Then he pressed the shutter. The flash illuminated the house for a brief, blinding second. The photograph appeared. At first it looked normal, just an empty living room. But as Ethan's eyes moved across the image, he felt the world tilt beneath him. Because standing in the center of the photograph was Ethan. Not the Ethan holding the phone, another Ethan. He stood several feet away in the living room, staring directly at the camera with the same expression of confusion and fear. And behind that version of Ethan, the man stood quietly, closer than ever. So close that his shadow merged with Ethan's. Ethan's fingers went numb. The phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the floor. He turned slowly. The living room was empty. No second Ethan. No man. Just the quiet house and the soft hum of electricity in the walls. For a moment, he stood there, trying to steady his breathing. Then he heard something behind him. A faint sound. The quiet click of a camera shutter. Ethan turned toward the coffee table. The phone lay on the floor beside it. Its screen lit up briefly. Another photograph had been taken. He stepped forward slowly and picked it up. The image filled the screen. It showed the living room exactly as it looked now, except for one difference. The room was empty. No Ethan. No one standing near the couch. Only the quiet furniture and the dim light from the lamp. But near the far end of the room, standing just beside the hallway, was Ethan. He faced the camera, completely still. And behind him, no one at all. Just darkness. Because the man was no longer in the photograph. He didn't need to be anymore.